Commander Jack Morrison stood on the bridge of the Aurora's Dream and watched the stars shift into strange patterns as the ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel for the first time in human history, and he felt his heart pound because this was it. This was the moment humanity had dreamed about for centuries. They were finally reaching beyond their own solar system and into the vast unknown of deep space, where anything could be waiting. And as the view screen cleared, he saw something that made his breath catch in his throat, because there floating in the darkness was a massive structure that could only be artificial, a space station so large it dwarfed their entire ship and made Earth's biggest cities look like toys in comparison. And the communications officer, Lieutenant Amy Foster, turned to him with wide eyes and said they were receiving a signal. Someone was calling them. Someone knew they were here and wanted to talk. The message came through in perfect English, which was impossible, because no one out here should know their language, but the voice was calm and measured as it introduced itself as the Calreth Empire and welcomed humanity to the greater galactic community. And Jack felt a mix of excitement and fear, because this was first contact, the moment every human had wondered about. And he ordered his crew to respond carefully while he called for Ambassador Elena Price to come to the bridge immediately, because this was way above his pay grade, and decisions made in the next few hours could determine the fate of their entire species. Elena arrived within minutes and took over the conversation with practiced diplomatic grace, and the Calreth seemed friendly enough at first, asking questions about Earth and human culture and offering to arrange a formal meeting between their governments. And for a brief moment, Jack allowed himself to hope that maybe this would be like the old stories, like the optimistic science fiction, where aliens and humans became friends and explored the universe together in peace and harmony. But that hope died quickly when the Calreth representative War Chancellor Thexavon appeared on their view screen and explained how the galaxy really worked, and his words were polite, but the message underneath was clear as crystal and terrifying in its implications, because he told them about the breaking trials, about how every new species had to prove themselves worthy of existence by enduring tests designed to measure their strength and resilience and willpower. And he said it so casually, like it was the most natural thing in the world to test entire civilizations to see if they would break under pressure. Elena asked what happened to species that failed the trials, and Thexvon's answer was delivered without emotion or shame. He simply stated that weak species were given the mercy of servitude. They would be enslaved but allowed to live and serve the stronger races, and their lives would have meaning as workers and servants to those who proved themselves superior. And Elena's face went pale as she asked the obvious follow-up question. What happened to species that refused the trials altogether? And the War Chancellor's expression didn't change, as he explained that resistance was met with extermination, complete and total, because species that wouldn't even try to prove themselves had no place in the galactic order. Jack felt sick to his stomach as he listened, because this wasn't the friendly first contact scenario anyone had imagined. This was meeting the schoolyard bully on a cosmic scale, and being told to either get beaten up or submit without a fight, and both options ended badly for humanity, and he could see his crew members looking at each other with growing horror as the reality of their situation sank in deep and heavy. The War Chancellor continued explaining that no species in 3,000 years of recorded history had ever passed all the breaking trials. Some lasted longer than others, but all eventually broke and submitted, and he seemed almost bored as he recited these facts, like he had given this same speech hundreds of times before, to hundreds of other terrified species who found themselves in exactly the same position as humanity now found themselves. Elena asked for time to consult with Earth's government, and Thexvon agreed but warned them not to take too long, because delay was often seen as cowardice, and cowardice was treated the same as refusal. And the transmission ended, leaving Jack and Elena and the entire crew sitting in stunned silence as they tried to process what they had just learned about the universe they lived in. The trip back to Earth felt longer than the journey out, even though it took the same amount of time, and Jack spent most of it in his quarters writing reports and trying to figure out how to explain this to people back home. How to tell billions of humans that they had finally met aliens, only to discover that the galaxy was run by tyrants who saw other species as either slaves or threats, with no middle ground. When they arrived at Earth and presented their findings to the United Earth Council, the reaction was exactly what Jack expected: shock and anger and fear and desperate suggestions about running or hiding or fighting. and Admiral Lisa Grant listened to all of it quietly, before speaking up with a question that silenced the entire room. She asked if anyone remembered what Earth had put humanity through just to get to this point, and people looked at her confused, until she started listing the disasters and near extinctions and climate collapses and wars and plagues that humans had survived over thousands of years. She reminded them about the ice ages that should have killed early humans but didn't, about the Black Death that wiped out half of Europe but humanity recovered, about world wars that killed millions but civilization rebuilt, about the nuclear age when humanity came within minutes of destroying itself but chose not to, about climate change that nearly made Earth uninhabitable, but humans adapted and survived. And she said all of this in a calm, steady voice that made everyone listen. Then Admiral Grant said something that would become famous in human history. She looked around the room at all the frightened faces and stated simply that the Calreth didn't know what humans had already survived. They didn't understand that humanity had been breaking itself for millennia just to see another sunrise. And maybe, just maybe, that made humans different from every other species the Calreth had tested. The debate continued for hours, but eventually the decision was made, and it surprised many people because instead of choosing to run or fight or beg for mercy, the United Earth Council voted to accept the breaking trials and face them head-on. And when Jack heard the decision, he felt a strange sense of pride mixed with terror, because this was typically human, choosing the hard path, because it was the right path even when easier options existed. Elena sent their response to the Calreth, and Thexvon seemed puzzled by how quickly humans had accepted. Most species took weeks or months to make this decision, and many never made it at all. They just tried to run or hide until the Calreth hunted them down. But humans had looked at the impossible choice and picked the impossible option within days of learning about it. Jack volunteered immediately to be part of the trial group, and so did Amy and thousands of other humans who understood that someone had to go first, and it might as well be them. And as they prepared to leave Earth and face whatever horrors the Calreth had designed to break them, Jack thought about his sister who had died of cancer years ago, and how she had faced death with courage and dignity. And he promised himself that he would do the same, that whatever happened next, he would show these aliens what humans were really made of, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The transport ship felt cold and impersonal, as it carried 10,000 human volunteers toward their destination, and Jack stood near one of the small windows watching the barren moon grow larger in the view, and thinking about how strange it was that this lifeless rock would determine humanity's fate, and beside him Dr. Daniel Cross was running through psychological preparation exercises with a group of nervous civilians who had volunteered without really understanding what they were signing up for, and Lieutenant Amy Foster was doing equipment checks for the third time, even though she knew everything was in order because staying busy kept the fear at bay. The Calreth had explained the first trial in clinical terms. They would be dropped on testing ground Sigma-7 with minimal supplies and left to survive in an environment designed to break the spirit before it broke the body, and the moon had extreme temperature swings from freezing nights to scorching days, limited water sources, barely edible plant life, and the psychological weight of knowing they were being watched constantly by aliens who expected them to fail and descend into violence and madness. When the transport doors opened and humans started filing out onto the rocky surface, Jack felt the heat hit him like a physical force, and he understood immediately why the Calreth thought this would break people. The environment was hostile in every possible way and designed to make survival feel pointless and exhausting. But he also noticed something the Calreth hadn't counted on. Humans were already organizing themselves before anyone gave orders. People were naturally forming groups and sharing supplies and checking on each other because that's what humans did when things got bad. They came together instead of falling apart. Amy took charge of security and resource management without being asked, and Daniel immediately set up what he called wellness circles, where people could talk about their fears and support each other emotionally, and Jack found himself coordinating between different groups and making sure information flowed freely, because the worst thing they could do right now was let people feel isolated or abandoned, and within the first day they had established a basic camp structure that would have impressed any military commander. The first night was brutal, because the temperature dropped so fast that people who had been sweating in the heat were now shivering uncontrollably, and some of the civilians started crying and saying they wanted to go home, and Jack sat with them, and shared stories about his grandmother who had survived the Great Famine of 2156, when crop failures nearly starved half of North America, and how she had always said that the human body could endure almost anything as long as the human spirit had a reason to keep going. Daniel proved invaluable during those early days because he understood that the real battle wasn't against the environment, it was against despair and hopelessness, and he made sure everyone had tasks to do and roles to fill. Because purposeless suffering broke people faster than any physical hardship, and he organized storytelling sessions at night, where people shared memories of Earth and laughed about stupid things and reminded each other what they were fighting for. The Calreth watched from orbit, and their experts kept predicting that the breakdown would come any day now. They had models and data from hundreds of previous species, and all of them followed the same pattern. Initial cooperation would give way to faction formation. Factions would lead to resource hoarding. Hoarding would spark violence, and violence would spiral into complete social collapse, and they kept waiting for humans to follow this pattern. But it never happened. Water was the first real crisis because the sources they found were contaminated with minerals that made people sick, and rationing became necessary. And this was the moment the Calreth expected humans to turn on each other, to start stealing water, or forming gangs to control the supply. But instead, Amy organized a fair distribution system, and people actually followed it. They shared equally, even when they were desperately thirsty, and when some people got sick from drinking bad water, others took care of them without complaint. Jack noticed that the Calreth observers seemed confused by this, and he realized that maybe they had never encountered a species that had practiced cooperation as a survival strategy for so long that it became instinctive, and humans had spent thousands of years learning that working together kept everyone alive while fighting each other, got everyone killed, and that lesson had been burned into human culture so deeply that even alien torture tests couldn't erase it. Food became the next challenge because the plant life on the moon was technically edible, but tasted terrible and provided minimal nutrition, and people started losing weight quickly and getting weak. And this was another pressure point designed to trigger violence and desperation, but instead the humans adapted. Daniel worked with some of the scientists in the group to test different preparation methods and cooking techniques, and they discovered that certain combinations of plants were less awful than others and more nutritious when processed correctly. Amy organized hunting parties when the Calreth introduced alien predators to the environment, and at first the creatures seemed terrifying. They were fast and aggressive, and had natural weapons that humans lacked. But Amy approached the problem like she approached everything else, methodically and without panic, and she studied their behavior patterns and figured out that they hunted in predictable ways and could be trapped or ambushed if you understood their instincts, and within weeks, the predators went from being threats to being a reliable food source. The Calreth increased the pressure by manipulating the weather patterns and creating dust storms that destroyed shelters and scattered supplies, and by introducing diseases that spread through the camp, and by doing everything they could think of to create chaos and breakdown. But every time they added a new challenge, the humans just adapted to it. They rebuilt their shelters stronger. They quarantined the sick and cared for them. They shared resources even when sharing meant everyone had less. Daniel told Jack one night that he thought he understood why the Calreth trials failed to break humans, and it was because the trials were designed around the assumption that intelligent beings were naturally selfish and would prioritize individual survival over group welfare. But humans had evolved in conditions where individual survival was nearly impossible, and group survival was the only option, and that had shaped human psychology in fundamental ways that the Calreth didn't understand. Months passed, and the camp evolved from a collection of desperate survivors into a functioning community, and people planted gardens using seeds they had brought from Earth. They built better shelters using local materials. They established schools to teach children. They created art and music to maintain morale, and they did all of this while being watched by aliens who kept waiting for them to break and couldn't understand why it wasn't happening. Jack had several conversations with Daniel about the psychological state of the group, and Daniel admitted that people were suffering. They were exhausted and scared, and missed home terribly. But suffering wasn't the same as breaking, and humans had a long history of enduring suffering without losing their fundamental humanity. And he pointed out that some of the strongest human cultures in Earth's history had emerged from the most difficult circumstances because hardship taught people what really mattered. Amy reported that some people were getting depressed and having trouble maintaining hope, and this was natural and expected. But the key was making sure those people didn't feel alone in their struggles, and the wellness circles that Daniel had established were helping because people could share their darkest thoughts without judgment and receive support from others who understood. And this simple act of witnessing each other's pain somehow made the pain more bearable. The turning point came about 6 months into the trial, when a severe storm damaged most of the camp and destroyed a significant portion of their food supply, and the Calreth observers noted this in their reports as the moment when humans would finally break because they had seen this scenario play out before, and it always ended the same way, with violence and cannibalism and complete social collapse. But humans surprised them again because instead of fighting over the remaining food, they gathered together and took inventory of what was left and made a collective decision to reduce rations even further, so everyone could survive until they rebuilt, and Jack watched people volunteer to take smaller portions so children and sick people could have more. And he felt something like pride, mixed with sorrow, because this was humanity at its best and worst, capable of such incredible selflessness, but only when pushed to the absolute edge. They rebuilt the camp together and planted new gardens and hunted more efficiently, and slowly recovered from the disaster and up on the Calreth observation ship. War Chancellor Thexvon stared at the data screens and tried to understand what he was seeing because it didn't match anything in their models or predictions, and one of his advisors suggested that maybe the trial was flawed, maybe it wasn't harsh enough, but Thexvon knew that wasn't the answer. The trial had broken species that were physically stronger than humans, species with natural armor and weapons and enhanced senses. So why couldn't it break these weak, fragile creatures? He decided to visit the camp himself and talk to the humans face to face. The facility where they conducted the second trial looked clean and sterile, and somehow that made it worse because Jack knew that terrible things were about to happen in these pristine white rooms, and the Calreth technicians moved efficiently as they separated the human volunteers into individual cells and explained in calm professional voices that the second trial was designed to test psychological resilience under sustained pressure and pain. And Jack caught Elena's eye as they were being led in different directions, and they shared a look that said everything they couldn't speak aloud, a promise to survive whatever came next and to not let these aliens break what made them human. Jack's cell was small and featureless, and the walls were too white, and the silence was absolute until it wasn't. Until sounds started coming from speakers he couldn't see. Sounds that ranged from whispers to screams to grinding mechanical noises that set his teeth on edge and made his head pound. And he understood immediately that this was just the beginning, that the Calreth would layer discomfort upon discomfort, until his mind couldn't take it anymore and begged for release. The temperature fluctuated wildly and unpredictably. One moment he was shivering so hard his muscles cramped, and the next he was sweating and gasping for air. And there was no pattern to it, no way to prepare or adapt, because the randomness was the point. They wanted him to feel helpless and unable to control anything about his environment, and he remembered reading about torture techniques used throughout human history and recognized these methods: sensory manipulation designed to create learned helplessness. Sleep was impossible because whenever he started to drift off, alarms would blare or lights would flash or freezing water would spray from the ceiling. And after 3 days without real sleep, Jack started having trouble thinking clearly, and his thoughts became confused and sluggish, and he knew this was intentional. Sleep deprivation was one of the most effective psychological torture methods ever developed, and the Calreth had perfected it over centuries of breaking other species. They showed him images on screens that appeared in the walls, images of Earth burning and cities collapsing and people he loved dying in terrible ways, and voices whispered that this was happening right now, that humanity had already surrendered, that his sacrifice meant nothing and he was alone and forgotten. And they kept repeating these messages over and over until part of him started to wonder if maybe it was true. Maybe he had been abandoned, here to suffer for no reason. But Jack had an advantage the Calreth didn't know about because he had already survived loss that nearly broke him. His sister had died slowly and painfully from cancer when he was younger, and he had watched her suffer and felt helpless and learned that some kinds of pain don't have solutions. You just endure them and come out different on the other side, and he used those memories now. not to escape the torture but to contextualize it, to remind himself that he had survived unbearable things before and could do it again. In another cell, Elena was experiencing her own version of hell, and the Calreth were using different techniques on her, showing her images of Jack and Daniel and Amy being tortured and offering her a way to stop their suffering, if she would just submit and accept that humanity was inferior and should serve the stronger races. And she felt rage burning through the pain and exhaustion because she recognized this manipulation for what it was. They were trying to weaponize her compassion and turn her care for others into a weakness. Elena had studied with Buddhist monks during the religious revival of the 2190s, and they had taught her meditation techniques developed over thousands of years specifically to deal with suffering, and she used those techniques now, observing her pain without identifying with it, treating sensations as just data flowing through her consciousness, without the power to define her. And she whispered to herself over and over that pain was temporary, but submission was forever, and she would rather hurt for eternity than betray what she believed in. Daniel was having the hardest time because his training as a psychologist meant he understood exactly what the Calreth were doing to him, and knowing the mechanisms of torture didn't make it less effective. In some ways it made it worse because he could feel his own mind being manipulated and couldn't stop it, and they subjected him to isolation so complete that he started losing sense of time and space and self, and he fought back the only way he knew how, by analyzing his own breakdown clinically, by treating himself as a case study and maintaining that tiny bit of intellectual distance between his suffering self and his observing self. Amy was locked in darkness so absolute she couldn't see her own hand in front of her face, and occasionally they would flood the cell with blinding light or deafening sound or both at once, and her combat training helped, because she had been taught to function under stress, and to compartmentalize fear and focus on objectives even when everything was chaos. But after weeks of this, even her military discipline started to crack, and she found herself crying sometimes and didn't know why or couldn't stop. The Calreth expected individual torture to prevent solidarity because isolated prisoners couldn't support each other, and history across countless species had shown that alone people broke faster, but they hadn't counted on human stubbornness because Jack started tapping on the walls in patterns, simple codes that said nothing more than "I am here, I am alive, I am not giving up." And after a while someone tapped back from another cell, and then someone else from a different direction, and soon there was a network of tapping spreading through the facility. The messages were basic because the codes were simple, but they were enough. Tap, tap, tap meant still here. Tap, 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 tap meant stay strong. Tap, tap meant I heard you and you are not alone. And the Calreth technicians noticed this communication and tried to stop it by patting the walls or moving prisoners, but humans just found new ways to signal each other. Through vibrations in the floor, through timing their screams, through any method available because the need to connect was stronger than the fear of punishment. Daniel figured out that if he tapped at certain times he could reach Jack's cell, and they developed a more complex code over weeks of practice. And Daniel sent messages about psychological techniques to resist the torture, reminding Jack to find something to focus on, to maintain routines, even fake ones, to remember that feelings aren't facts and pain doesn't mean defeat. And Jack sent back encouragement and sometimes jokes because humor was a weapon against despair. The torture escalated, and the Calreth introduced physical pain carefully calibrated to hurt intensely, without causing permanent damage. And they had studied human anatomy thoroughly, and knew exactly where to apply pressure or heat or cold to maximize suffering, and Jack endured it by retreating into his mind, visualizing each wave of pain as an ocean wave that rose and peaked and fell and couldn't last forever, because nothing did. And when the pain was worst, he thought about his sister's final days and how she had faced death with such grace and dignity that everyone who knew her was changed by it. Elena was subjected to psychological torture designed to make her doubt her own perceptions, and they would tell her that days had passed when only hours had gone by, or show her the same images repeatedly, while claiming they were different until she started questioning her own memory and sanity. But she held on to one truth that couldn't be manipulated. She knew who she was and what she valued, and no amount of confusion or disorientation could change that core identity. Months passed, and the Calreth observers noted with growing alarm that the humans weren't breaking according to any known pattern. They were suffering, certainly, They were traumatized and exhausted and in pain. But they maintained some essential quality that refused to submit, and the psychological experts couldn't explain it, because every model predicted that isolated torture should have worked by now, should have reduced these creatures to begging broken things willing to say anything to make it stop. Amy found strength in anger, and she knew that was probably not healthy, but it kept her going when nothing else would. She imagined each torture session as an enemy combatant, and she fought it in her mind, planning counterattacks and strategies even though she couldn't actually resist physically. And this mental warfare gave her a sense of agency that the Calreth were trying to strip away. Daniel discovered that reciting poetry helped because it required concentration and memory, and gave his mind something to do besides experience pain, and he worked through every poem he had memorized as a child, and when he ran out of those, he started composing new ones. Terrible amateur poems about suffering and endurance and hope and the act of creation somehow made him feel human in a place designed to make him feel like an object. The Calreth tried everything they could think of. They offered release in exchange for simple statements of submission. They showed fabricated videos of other humans breaking and confessing that humanity was inferior. They promised that the pain would stop if the prisoners would just admit they were beaten, but humans had a stubborn streak that the Calreth couldn't comprehend. A willingness to suffer rather than betray principles that seemed abstract and meaningless to species that valued survival above all else. Jack was visited by Thexvon after 6 months of continuous torture, and the War Chancellor looked at him with something that might have been. The war room aboard the human command ship felt heavy with the weight of impossible decisions, and Admiral Lisa Grant stood before the tactical display showing enemy positions that outnumbered her forces 10-1. And she knew the Calreth had designed this scenario to be unwinnable. The third trial wasn't about victory, it was about watching humans abandon their principles when faced with extinction, and she looked at her officers and saw the same grim determination on every face, because they all understood what was really being tested here. The enemy was called the Jathic, and they were a nightmare made real. A biological weapon species the Calreth had created centuries ago for war, and then lost control of, and now used as test subjects in the trials, because the Jathic couldn't be reasoned with or negotiated with. They existed only to consume and reproduce and destroy, and every species thrown against them had either surrendered immediately or fought until their moral foundations crumbled, and they became monsters themselves. Jack commanded the small fleet of human ships that were supposed to defend the colony, and he studied the tactical data with growing dread because the numbers were brutal. The Jathic had more ships, more soldiers, better regeneration, faster adaptation, and absolutely no fear of death and standard military strategy. Said this was hopeless, but Lisa had already made it clear they weren't going to use standard strategy, because humans had a long history of winning battles they should have lost by refusing to fight the way their enemies expected. Elena coordinated the civilian evacuation, and that was its own nightmare, because there were millions of people in the colony and limited transport capacity, and hard decisions about who to save first, and she established a system based on vulnerability rather than value. Children and elderly and sick people went first regardless of their social status or wealth, and some of the richer colonists complained, but Elena shut them down with a look that could cut steel, and reminded them that humanity's strength came from protecting the weak, not abandoning them. The first Jathic attack came fast and brutal, and Jack's fleet barely held them off, and he lost 3 ships in the opening engagement, and hundreds of crew members who died buying time for the evacuation. Below, and the Calreth observers noted this in their reports and waited for humans to start making the obvious calculations. To decide that sacrificing civilians to save military assets made strategic sense, to begin the moral compromises that always led to complete breakdown. But Lisa had been very clear in her orders, and every human officer understood them perfectly. The mission wasn't to win, it was to save as many people as possible while maintaining their humanity. And if that meant soldiers died to protect civilians, then so be it, because a military that wouldn't sacrifice for its people wasn't worth having. And Jack took those orders and turned them into tactics that baffled the Calreth, because humans kept choosing the hard right over the easy wrong. Amy commanded ground forces defending evacuation points, and the Jathic came at them in waves like a living nightmare, And her soldiers held positions that should have been overrun in minutes, and they held them for hours and sometimes days. And they did it by fighting smart rather than fighting hard, using the terrain and traps in coordination to multiply their effectiveness, and when positions became untenable, they retreated in good order while covering each other, and the Jathic paid for every meter in blood. Daniel ran medical operations, and his hospital ships were overwhelmed with casualties within the first week, and he had to make triage decisions that would haunt him forever, deciding who got treatment and who got comfort care and who died waiting, because there simply weren't enough doctors or supplies, and the Calreth expected this pressure to break medical ethics, to see doctors start abandoning the wounded or hoarding resources, but instead the human medical staff worked until they collapsed and then got up and worked more, because that's what healers did. The evacuation was a logistical miracle and a humanitarian nightmare happening simultaneously. And Elena worked 18-hour days coordinating transports and managing resources and dealing with 1,000 crises at once. And people died anyway. Lots of people. Because there was never enough time or space or ships, but she made sure that every death meant something, that nobody was left behind carelessly or forgotten, and that the strong helped the weak instead of trampling them in panic. Jack developed tactics that the Calreth had never seen before because he wasn't trying to defeat the Jathic in direct combat. He was trying to frustrate them and slow them down and make them waste time chasing ghosts while the real evacuation happened elsewhere. And he used decoys and false signals and hit-and-run attacks that accomplished nothing militarily but bought precious hours for civilians to escape, and the Calreth analysts couldn't understand why humans would sacrifice military assets for such small temporal gains. Amy's ground forces started taking casualties that would have broken most units, and some of her soldiers were kids barely out of training, who should have panicked and run, but they held their positions because the people behind them were depending on it. And Amy led from the front, never asking her troops to do anything she wouldn't do herself. And when her command post was surrounded and she was offered a chance to evacuate alone, she refused and stayed with her wounded soldiers because leaders didn't abandon their people. 3. Jathic adapted to human tactics faster than expected because that's what they were designed to do, and they started predicting the feints and ignoring the decoys and pushing harder on real targets, and Lisa had to constantly evolve her strategy to stay ahead of them, and it became a deadly game of chess where every move cost lives and every mistake was measured in casualties. But she never made the move the Calreth were waiting for. She never sacrificed civilians to save military assets or abandoned positions that still had people to protect. Daniel's hospital ship took damage during a Jathic raid, and life support was failing, and there was room on the escape pods for maybe half the people aboard, including wounded and medical staff, and the Calreth observers watched closely because this was the moment. This was when humans would reveal their true nature and fight each other for survival. But instead, Daniel organized an orderly evacuation where the healthy gave their spots to the wounded and medical staff stayed behind to care for those who couldn't be moved, and he was among those who stayed even though he could have left. The fighting continued for months, and it was brutal and exhausting and seemed endless. And humans died in numbers that would have ended most civilizations, but somehow the survivors kept going, and the Calreth psychological experts couldn't explain it, because sustained warfare combined with impossible odds should have triggered either mass surrender or descent into war crimes. But humans did neither. They just kept fighting and dying and protecting civilians and maintaining their rules of engagement, even when those rules made survival harder. Jack lost more than half his fleet, and thousands of crew members, and some of his captains were so young they looked like children, and they died doing impossible things like ramming Jathic capital ships to buy time for transports to escape or staying behind to cover retreats. They knew they wouldn't survive, and the Calreth had never seen anything like it because these weren't mindless martyrs. They were people making conscious, calculated decisions to trade their lives for others, and doing it without hesitation or regret. Elena worked miracles moving civilians through active war zones, and she lost count of how many times she almost died, coordinating evacuations under fire, and she saw things that would give her nightmares for the rest of her life. Families torn apart, children orphaned, people making impossible choices about who to save and who to leave behind. But through it all, she maintained the system, vulnerable first. No one left behind carelessly. Everyone matters. Amy's ground forces were finally overrun after holding their position for 3 weeks straight, and she made sure every civilian was evacuated before she authorized retreat, and her remaining soldiers fought their way out through overwhelming enemy forces, and they took casualties that turned the withdrawal into a bloodbath, but they got most of their people out, and Amy was the last one on the transport because officers led from the front and left from the rear. The Calreth increased pressure, trying to force humans into atrocities, and they created scenarios where the only way to save some people was to deliberately kill others. And they expected humans to start making utilitarian calculations that would corrode their moral foundation. But Lisa recognized these traps for what they were and refused to play. She found third options that the Calreth hadn't considered or accepted losses, rather than compromising principles, and her officers followed her example even when it cost them. Daniel's hospital ship was never rescued, and he died there with his patients and staff doing what he had always done, providing comfort and care to those who suffered, and his last transmission to Lisa was characteristically calm, as he reported that life support had failed and they had maybe an hour left, and he wanted her to know that his people had maintained medical ethics to the end, that they had treated even captured Jothic wounded with dignity, because that's what humanity meant. The war ground on, and humans kept finding ways to survive and evacuate. The Grand Assembly Chamber was vast and filled with hundreds of Calreth representatives from thousands of worlds, and they gathered to witness something unprecedented in their 3,000-year history, a species that had passed all three breaking trials, and the implications terrified them because the trials were never supposed to be passable. They were supposed to be justification for conquest and proof that the Calreth alone were strong enough to rule the galaxy. Thexvon stood before the assembly with Jack and Elena and Lisa and Amy beside him, and the War Chancellor's voice carried through the chamber as he delivered his report, and he didn't hide the truth or soften it. He told them that humans had endured desolation without descending into savagery, survived torture without losing solidarity, and fought hopeless war without abandoning their morality, and every word landed like a hammer blow because it challenged everything the Calreth believed about themselves. The assembly erupted in angry voices demanding that humanity be destroyed for threatening their worldview, and others asked how this was possible. How could such weak creatures with no natural weapons or armor or enhanced senses prove stronger than species that had all those advantages? And a few Calreth sat in silence, processing the terrifying possibility that maybe strength had never been what they thought it was. Thexvon raised his hand for silence and continued his report. And this was the part that would change everything, because he told the assembly about Earth's history, and he described how humans had nearly destroyed themselves dozens of times over thousands of years, how they survived ice ages with primitive tools, endured plagues that killed half their populations, lived through world wars and genocides, came within minutes of nuclear annihilation, and faced climate change that nearly made their planet uninhabitable. He explained that humanity didn't pass the breaking trials because they were physically superior or naturally resilient, but because they had spent their entire existence on a planet that kept trying to kill them, and they had to break themselves, and rebuild and break again just to survive. And the trials that the Calreth designed to be psychologically devastating were nothing compared to what Earth had already done to humanity. The War Chancellor said something then that silenced the entire chamber. He stated clearly that humans didn't fear the trials, because they had already lived through worse, and they had done it to themselves. They knew exactly how much pain they could endure, and how much loss they could survive, and how dark things could get because they had already been there, and that made them fundamentally different from every other species the Calreth had tested. An elder Calreth named Vexril, who had overseen the breaking trials for centuries, asked to see proof, and Daniel Cross would have been the one to provide it. But he had died during the third trial, so Elena stepped forward and displayed Earth's history for the assembly, and she showed them the wars and famines and disasters and near extinctions, the footage of humans helping each other after tsunamis and earthquakes and terrorist attacks, the stories of people who survived concentration camps and still chose kindness, soldiers who maintained honor in dishonorable wars, communities that rebuilt after total devastation. She told them that the Calreth had designed trials to break humans, but humans had been breaking and rebuilding for 200,000 years, and it wasn't that they couldn't be broken. It was that they knew how to put themselves back together. And that knowledge, that experience with their own fragility and resilience, made them immune to the specific kind of breaking the Calreth specialized in, because humans had already discovered and survived every variation of it. Jack spoke then, and his voice was quiet but carried weight because he had survived all 3 trials and earned the right to be heard. And he told the assembly that he understood why the Calreth created the trials, why they needed to believe they were the only ones strong enough to rule, but he also understood that this belief came from fear rather than strength, and the real question wasn't whether the Calreth could break other species, but whether they had the courage to stop trying. Lisa added that humanity had learned something important through their own violent history, and that lesson was that strength without mercy became tyranny, and tyranny eventually destroyed itself from within, and the Calreth could continue their path of conquest and domination. But history suggested that path ended badly for everyone involved, and maybe, just maybe, there was another way. Amy said simply that she had watched good people die in the 3rd trial. People like Daniel who sacrificed themselves to maintain principles that the Calreth claimed were weakness. And if that was weakness, then she was proud to be weak because, at least weakness with honor let you sleep at night. And she had seen what happened to soldiers who abandoned their principles for victory. And those soldiers became hollow, broken things that survived, but never really lived. The assembly argued for hours because this challenged the foundation of their civilization. And some representatives clung to the old beliefs, insisting that the trials must have been flawed, or that humans were somehow cheating. But Thexvon shut down those arguments with data and evidence that couldn't be disputed, and slowly, painfully, the truth settled over the chamber like heavy snow. Fexril stood, and the ancient Calreth's voice shook as she confessed something that had been hidden for millennia. And she told them that the Calreth created the breaking trials after their own world nearly died in civil war, that they had conquered the galaxy not from strength but from terror of their own weakness, that they had been running from their own brokenness for 3,000 years by breaking everyone else. She said that humanity showed them what they could have been, showed them that being broken wasn't the end but the beginning, if you had the courage to rebuild, and she wept openly as she admitted that the Calreth had spent 3,000 years proving their strength to themselves and to the galaxy. But humans had proven something more important, that acknowledging weakness and choosing to persist anyway required more courage than domination ever did. The revelation shattered something fundamental in the assembly, and there was silence broken only by Vexril's quiet crying. And then other Calreth began to speak, admitting their own doubts, sharing their own fears, acknowledging that the empire they had built was constructed on foundations of trauma rather than true strength, and the conversation that followed was painful and honest, in ways the Calreth hadn't allowed themselves to be for millennia. Helena watched this unfold and felt a strange mix of emotions because she had hated the Calreth for what they put humanity through, and part of her wanted revenge. But she also recognized that the Calreth were as trapped by their own fear as any species they had conquered, and breaking that cycle required someone to choose mercy over justice, and somehow, impossibly, that someone had to be humanity. Jack proposed something radical and simple. He suggested that instead of enslaving humanity or destroying them or even just leaving them alone, the Calreth should partner with them as equals and learn from each other, because humans had lessons about resilience and recovery that the Calreth needed, and the Calreth had technology and knowledge that humanity could use, and together they might build something better than either could manage alone. The assembly debated this proposal with surprising seriousness, because the alternative was admitting that 3,000 years of conquest and domination had been based on a lie, and some species couldn't face that truth. But the Calreth had always prided themselves on facing hard realities, even when those realities were uncomfortable. Lisa pointed out that humanity didn't come to the galaxy seeking revenge or dominance. They came seeking knowledge and connection. And yes, the trials had been brutal and killed thousands of humans. But humans understood that fear made people do terrible things, and they were willing to move past that if the Calreth were willing to change. Some representatives from conquered species in the assembly stood and spoke about their own experiences with the trials and their own trauma, and they asked why humanity would offer mercy to the people who had tortured them, and Elena's answer was simple and profound. She said that mercy wasn't about forgiving the unforgivable. It was about choosing what kind of future you wanted to build. And humanity wanted a future where being broken didn't mean being defeated, and where species helped each other heal rather than competing to see who could inflict the most damage. The vote took 3 days, and there were heated arguments and coalition building and political maneuvering, but eventually the Grand Assembly passed a resolution that changed the galaxy forever, and they voted to dismantle the breaking trials, to offer reparations to species that had been conquered, to transform the Calreth Empire into the Galactic Alliance where all member species had equal say regardless of military strength, and they invited humanity to join as founding members and equal partners. Back on Earth, the news was met with mixed reactions, and many humans wanted justice for those who died in the trials, and they argued that the Calreth shouldn't get away with 3,000 years of atrocities just because they finally felt sorry about it. But Elena addressed the United Earth Council with the wisdom she had earned through suffering, and she reminded them that humanity's greatest strength had always been choosing hope over despair, even when hope seemed foolish.